The dog had been staring at the same cellar wall for 3 days. He would not eat there. He would not sleep there. He would not leave it. Every morning, he walked down 13 wooden steps into the dim basement of the old tavern, sat in front of a section of stone wall that looked no different from the rest, and waited. At first, Jack Sullivan thought it was grief. Then he thought it was habit. By the 3rd day, he knew it was neither. Because Shadow had spent 8 years proving one thing over and over again. When the German Shepherd became obsessed with something, there was always a reason. Before we go any deeper, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. And subscribe if you believe dogs sometimes notice what people are too busy to see. The tavern stood on the edge of a small town in western Montana, where mountains watched over narrow streets and winter winds carried the scent of pine and chimney smoke. Most people hurried past the building without looking twice. Its faded sign creaked above the entrance. Dust coated the windows. The place looked forgotten. Yet somehow, 3 weeks earlier, it had become Jack's. The retired Navy SEAL stood alone behind the bar, polishing a glass he had already cleaned twice. The afternoon sun filtered through old windows, painting long golden lines across worn wooden floors. The tavern was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made old buildings feel as if they were listening. Somewhere beneath his feet, Shadow remained in the cellar. Waiting. Watching. Refusing to move. Jack set the glass aside and walked toward the basement door. The hinges groaned softly as he opened it. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the scent of stone, dust, and age. "You still down there?" he called. No answer. Only silence. Jack descended the steps. The cellar stretched beneath the tavern like a forgotten second world. Shelves lined the walls. Empty bottles rested beneath decades of dust. Old crates sat untouched in corners. At the far end of the room, Shadow sat exactly where Jack expected. Motionless. Focused. His amber eyes remained locked on the stone wall in front of him. Jack stopped beside the dog. "Buddy, there is nothing." "There." Shadow never looked away. The German Shepherd's ears twitched slightly. Then he stepped forward and pressed his nose against the stone. Once. Twice. Slowly. Deliberately. Jack frowned. He examined the wall more carefully. Rough gray stones. Old mortar. Nothing unusual. At least, not at first glance. He crouched beside Shadow and ran his hand along the surface. Cold. Solid. Ancient. Then his fingers paused. One section felt different. Barely different. A subtle change in texture. A faint gap hidden beneath years of dust. Jack leaned closer. The silence inside the cellar suddenly felt heavier. Above them, the tavern settled with a low creak. Outside, wind brushed against the windows. Shadow took a single step backward and sat down again. Waiting. Jack grabbed a nearby rag and brushed dust from the wall. More stone appeared. Then more. Finally, something else emerged. A thin iron edge hidden between the rocks. His heartbeat quickened immediately. He cleaned away another layer of dirt. The outline became clearer. Too straight to be natural. Too deliberate to be accidental. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor. Jack stared at the discovery for several long seconds. "What did you find?" he whispered. The dog simply watched him. There, buried behind decades of dust and silence, was the unmistakable outline of a concealed door hidden inside the cellar wall. And for reasons he could not explain, Jack suddenly understood why Shadow had refused to leave. 3 weeks earlier, before Shadow discovered the hidden door, and before Jack Sullivan became the owner of the old tavern, winter still held western Montana in its grip. Snow lined the edges of quiet roads. Ice clung to rooftops. The mountains surrounding the town stood beneath a pale gray sky. Jack and Shadow were passing through on their way home from a volunteer veterans event several counties away. Neither of them planned to stay. Neither of them knew their lives were about to change. The town itself looked like dozens of others scattered across the American West. One main street, one hardware store, a diner, a church with a white steeple, and at the far end of the road, an aging tavern with faded paint, and a sign that swayed gently in the wind. The building seemed forgotten, yet someone still cared enough to keep the lights on. Jack parked his truck near a grocery store and stepped outside. The cold air immediately bit through his jacket. Shadow jumped down beside him and stretched. The German Shepherd's breath formed small clouds against the winter air. Together they started toward a coffee shop across the street. Halfway there, Shadow stopped. His ears rose instantly. The dog turned toward a nearby crosswalk and stared. Jack followed his gaze. An elderly man stood alone near the curb carrying 2 paper grocery bags. He looked frail, thin. His movements were careful. The bags looked heavier than they should have been. Several people passed without noticing him. Then the old man stumbled. One bag slipped from his hand. Cans rolled across the sidewalk. Jack reacted immediately. "Come on." Within seconds he reached the man. "You okay, sir?" The elderly stranger looked embarrassed more than hurt. "I think so." Jack helped gather the groceries while Shadow quietly sat nearby watching everything. The old man smiled weakly. "Guess I am not as steady as I used to be." Jack handed him the recovered bag. "Happens to all of us eventually." The stranger laughed softly. His eyes carried warmth despite obvious exhaustion. "Not all of us get a warning first." They talked for a few minutes. Long enough for introductions. The old man's name was Walter Hayes, 82 years old, widower, owner of the tavern at the end of Main Street. "You run that place by yourself?" Jack asked. Walter nodded. "These days it mostly runs me." The answer made them both laugh. Before leaving, Jack offered to help carry the groceries home. Walter resisted at first, then accepted. The walk took only a few minutes. The tavern looked older up close. The windows needed work, and the porch sagged slightly. Yet something about the building felt welcoming, honest, like a place built from stories rather than money. Walter unlocked the front door and invited them inside. Warm air drifted from an old wood stove. The scent of oak smoke, coffee, and aged wood filled the room. Shadow immediately relaxed. The tavern was nearly empty. A few tables, a long wooden bar, framed photographs covering the walls. Decades of memories preserved beneath dust and soft light. Walter set the groceries down and smiled. "Least I can do is buy you a cup of coffee." Jack glanced around. "You have a nice place." The old man followed his gaze. Something changed in his expression. Pride mixed with sadness. "It used to be more than a tavern." Jack looked back at him. "What do you mean?" Walter hesitated, then smiled faintly. "That is a long story." Shadow wandered toward the rear of the room and stopped. The German shepherd stared quietly toward a closed door near the back hallway. For several seconds he did not move. Then he looked back toward Walter. The old tavern owner noticed. His smile faded slightly, almost as if the dog had reminded him of something he had spent years trying not to think about. Walter Hayes spent the next 2 hours telling stories nobody had asked to hear, but everyone secretly wanted. Snow drifted past the tavern windows while the old wood stove crackled softly in the corner. Outside, the town settled into evening. Inside, time seemed slower, warmer. The tavern felt less like a business than a living memory. Jack Sullivan sat at the bar nursing a second cup of coffee while Shadow rested beneath a nearby table. Every wall held photographs. Old ranchers, wedding parties, veterans, families gathered around holiday dinners. Generations had passed through this place. Walter noticed Jack studying the pictures and smiled. "Most people think it is just a tavern." He looked around the room. "Truth is, it was always something else." Jack glanced up. "Like what?" Walter's eyes drifted toward the framed photographs. "A place people came when they had nowhere else to go." The answer lingered in the warm air. The old man slowly walked toward one of the pictures hanging near the fireplace. The photograph showed a group of young men standing outside the tavern nearly 50 years earlier. One wore a military uniform. Another held a fishing pole. A third balanced a laughing child on his shoulders. "That was the summer after the flood," Walter said quietly. "Half the town lost their homes." He pointed toward the building around them. "People slept right here for weeks." Jack listened carefully. Walter moved to another photograph. "That family over there lost their ranch during a terrible winter." His smile softened. "Lived upstairs until spring." Story after story followed. Some were happy, some were painful. All of them carried the same message. The tavern had never truly belonged to Walter. It belonged to the people who passed through it. Shadow eventually stood and wandered through the room. The German shepherd moved slowly between tables, occasionally pausing near old photographs as if studying them. Walter watched him with unusual interest. "That dog reminds me of someone." Jack smiled. "A lot of people say that." Walter shook his head. "No, I mean really reminds me of someone." His eyes drifted toward a picture near the back hallway. Jack followed his gaze. The frame held a faded image of a younger Walter standing beside a German shepherd. The resemblance to Shadow was remarkable. Similar posture, similar eyes, similar quiet intelligence. "That was mine," Walter said softly. "Many years ago." Jack looked at the photograph again. What was his name? Walter's smile returned. Scout. The old man fell silent for several moments. Something about the memory seemed heavier than the others. Shadow slowly approached the photograph and sat beneath it. The room became strangely quiet. Even the stove seemed to crackle more softly. Walter stared at the dog. You know, he said, almost to himself, Scout used to do that too. Jack raised an eyebrow. Do what? Walter nodded toward the back hallway. Sit there and stare. The retired Navy SEAL looked toward the closed door at the end of the corridor. The same door Shadow had noticed earlier. The same door the dog kept glancing toward now. Walter's expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not sadness. Something closer to hesitation. As though a memory had suddenly returned. Jack noticed immediately. What's back there? Walter laughed quietly. Storage rooms. Old records. Things nobody cares about anymore. Yet his answer arrived too quickly. Shadow continued staring toward the hallway. The German. Shepard's ears remained alert. Walter looked away first. Outside, snow continued falling across the small Montana town. Inside, beneath decades of photographs and stories, the old tavern seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time, Jack began to suspect there was more hidden inside the building than memories alone. The next morning, Jack Sullivan planned to leave town. That had been the plan from the beginning. Finish breakfast, fuel the truck, and continue the drive home. Simple. Yet when he stepped downstairs from the small room Walter Hayes insisted he use for the night, something felt different. The tavern was unusually quiet. No smell of fresh coffee. No sound of dishes moving behind the bar. No old country music drifting from the radio. Only silence. The kind of silence that immediately feels wrong. Shadow noticed it first. The German Shepherd stopped halfway down the staircase. His ears rose. His eyes scanned the room below. Jack quickened his pace. Walter normally opened the tavern before sunrise. Every light was already on. The wood stove still burned softly. Yet the old man was nowhere in sight. Walter, Jack called. No answer. He moved behind the bar and toward the kitchen. Shadow followed close behind. They found Walter sitting in a chair near the back door. His eyes were closed. One hand rested on the table. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside him. Jack's heart jumped. He crossed the room quickly. Walter. The old man slowly opened his eyes. Relief washed through Jack immediately. Walter smiled weakly. Morning. The retired Navy SEAL exhaled. You scared me. Walter looked pale. More tired than the day before. Even his smile seemed smaller. Guess 82 finally caught up with me. Jack pulled out a chair and sat across from him. The old tavern owner stared out the window for several moments. Snow continued falling across Main Street. The town looked peaceful, almost frozen in time. Funny thing about getting old, Walter said quietly. You start noticing which stories are unfinished. Jack listened. Something in the old man's voice felt different. Heavier. More serious. Walter looked toward Shadow. The German Shepherd sat nearby, watching him closely. Your dog doesn't trust me. Jack smiled. Actually, he does. Walter shook his head. No. He sees something. The answer surprised him. Before Jack could respond, Walter reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded envelope. The paper looked old. Worn. The edges softened by years of handling. He placed it on the table between them. If anything happens to me, I want you to have this. Jack frowned immediately. Nothing is happening to you. Walter smiled sadly. Humor an old man. The room fell silent. Snow drifted beyond the window. The wood stove crackled softly. Finally, Jack picked up the envelope. No name appeared on the front. No address. Just a small drawing of the tavern made with fading blue ink. What is it? Jack asked. Walter's eyes settled on the envelope. A promise. The answer only deepened the mystery. Before Jack could ask another question, the front door opened. Two local residents entered carrying groceries and winter supplies. The moment they saw Walter, their expressions changed. Concern replaced surprise. You should be resting, one woman said. Walter laughed quietly. And miss all this excitement. Yet after they left, the concern lingered. Throughout the day, more townspeople stopped by. Some brought food. Others simply checked on him. Jack noticed something unusual. Every person treated Walter with remarkable affection, respect, gratitude, as though the old tavern owner had once done something important for all of them. Yet nobody explained what. That evening, after closing time, Walter stood alone in the main room staring at the photographs covering the walls. Shadow sat beside him. The dog remained focused on the old man, almost protective. Walter finally spoke without turning around. Some places survive because people need them. He paused. And some secrets survive because people aren't ready for them. Jack felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. The old man slowly looked toward the back hallway. Toward the same closed-door Shadow kept watching. Then Walter whispered something so quietly Jack almost missed it. Not much longer now. And for reasons he could not explain, the words stayed with him. Long after the tavern lights went out. 2 days later, Walter Hayes was gone. The news spread through the small Montana town before sunrise. By noon, every storefront, every diner booth, and every table inside the tavern carried the same quiet conversation. People spoke softly, slowly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something sacred. Snow continued falling outside, while a steady stream of visitors arrived to pay their respects. Jack Sullivan stood behind the bar watching them come and go. Farmers, teachers, veterans, truck drivers, families. Some stayed only a few minutes. Others remained for hours. Nearly every person had a story about Walter. A meal he provided when money was short. A place to stay during difficult times. Advice offered without judgment. Help given without expectation. The old man seemed to have touched every corner of the community. Shadow remained unusually quiet throughout the day. The German shepherd moved slowly through the tavern, occasionally stopping near familiar photographs or empty tables. Several people knelt to pet him. Others simply smiled. Everyone knew who he was. The dog who had followed Walter's final days with unusual attention. Late that afternoon, a local attorney named Claire Bennett entered carrying a leather briefcase. Her expression looked professional but sympathetic. Jack immediately knew why she was there. The attorney waited until the tavern emptied before approaching him. "Mr. Sullivan?" Jack nodded. "I have something for you." She removed a sealed envelope from the briefcase and placed it on the bar. The handwriting on the front belonged to Walter. Jack recognized it immediately. Claire folded her hands. Walter asked that this be delivered personally. The room suddenly felt smaller. The old wood walls, the photographs, the stove, everything seemed to hold its breath. Jack carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested a single letter and a legal document. He read the letter first. The words were simple, honest, written in Walter's familiar voice. "Thank you for helping an old man on a cold day. Most people would have kept walking. You didn't. Some debts cannot be repaid, but kindness should never go unanswered." Jack swallowed hard and continued reading. By the time he reached the final paragraph, disbelief had replaced grief. He looked up slowly. This cannot be right. Claire already knew what he had read. It is. Jack stared at the document again. Walter Hayes had left him the tavern. Everything. The building. The land beneath it. The contents. All of it. Silence settled across the room. Snow tapped gently against the windows. Shadow lifted his head from beneath a nearby table and looked toward Jack. "I barely knew him," Jack said. Claire nodded. A lot of people said the same thing. She hesitated before continuing. Walter didn't. The retired Navy SEAL sat down heavily on a bar stool. None of it made sense. There had to be family, relatives, someone closer, someone more deserving. Yet the legal papers appeared flawless. Claire reached into her briefcase once more. "There is something else." She placed a small brass key beside the document. The metal looked old, worn smooth by decades of handling. Jack frowned. "What's this for?" The attorney smiled faintly. "Walter said you would eventually need it. That was all. No explanation. No instructions. Just a key." Shadow stood and approached the bar. His nose moved toward the brass object. The German shepherd sniffed it once, then turned toward the back hallway, toward the same closed door he had watched since the day they arrived. Jack noticed immediately. So did Claire. The attorney glanced toward the hallway and lowered her voice. "Before he died, Walter told me something strange." Jack looked up. "What?" Claire hesitated. Then she smiled softly. "He said the tavern was never the real inheritance." The old building creaked quietly around them. Snow continued falling outside. And somewhere deep beneath the tavern, hidden behind stone and silence, a secret waited patiently for someone to find it. For the next several days, Jack Sullivan tried convincing himself that the tavern was simply an old building filled with old stories. That explanation would have been easier than inheriting property from a man he barely knew, easier than wondering why Walter Hayes had trusted him with everything, and easier than thinking about the brass key resting inside a drawer behind the bar. Yet every time Jack tried focusing on practical matters, Shadow reminded him of the unanswered questions. The German Shepherd spent more time in the cellar than anywhere else. Every morning, he walked downstairs. Every evening, he returned. Sometimes he sat quietly. Sometimes he paced. Most often, he stared at the same section of stone wall near the back corner. The behavior continued for 3 straight days. By the 4th day, Jack finally gave up pretending it meant nothing. The tavern itself seemed to notice. The building creaked constantly. Pipes rattled behind walls. Old floorboards shifted beneath every step. At night, the wood stove filled the rooms with warmth while snow piled against the windows outside. The place felt alive in a way newer buildings never did. Memories lingered here. Not ghosts. Memories. Hundreds of them. Jack spent his evenings studying old photographs and documents left behind by Walter. Each image revealed another piece of the tavern's history. Families gathered around holiday dinners. Veterans sharing stories. Travelers resting during winter storms. Community meetings. Fundraisers. Weddings. Funerals. The tavern appeared again and again at the center of people's lives. One afternoon, a woman named Margaret entered carrying a stack of old newspapers. She had known Walter for decades. "Thought you might want these," she said. Jack spent hours reading through them. The articles told stories most people had forgotten. During a blizzard 40 years earlier, the tavern housed stranded families. During a flood, volunteers organized rescue efforts from inside the building. During hard economic years, Walter quietly provided meals to people who could not afford them. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. The tavern was never just a business. It was a refuge, a shelter, a place where people came when life became difficult. That evening, Jack sat alone near the wood stove with one of the newspapers spread across his lap. Shadow stood suddenly and walked toward the cellar door. The movement caught his attention immediately. The dog paused, looked back, and waited. Jack sighed. "You are not going to let this go, are you?" Shadow turned and descended the stairs. The answer was obvious. Minutes later, Jack followed. The cellar felt colder than usual. Rows of dusty bottles lined wooden shelves. Old crates sat untouched in corners. The smell of stone and age filled the air. At the far end of the room, Shadow already sat before the wall, watching, waiting. The retired Navy SEAL approached slowly. The brass key remained in his pocket. He had carried it all day without realizing it. As he examined the wall more carefully, he noticed something new. The outline hidden beneath the dust appeared more defined than before. Not because it had changed, because he finally knew where to look. Stone surrounded a narrow iron frame, almost invisible, deliberately concealed. Jack brushed away another layer of dust. His fingers found a small metal plate near the edge of the wall. A keyhole, tiny, nearly hidden. Silence filled the cellar. Above them, the tavern settled with a low creak. Shadow stood and moved beside him. The German Shepherd's tail remained still. His eyes never left the wall. Jack slowly removed the brass key from his pocket. The metal felt heavier than it should have. He stared at it for several long seconds. Then he looked at Shadow. "If Walter wanted this hidden," he whispered, "why leave me the key?" The dog offered no answer. He simply watched. And for the first time since inheriting the tavern, Jack understood that whatever waited behind the wall was not an accident. Walter had planned for someone to find it. The question was why. Jack stared at the brass key for a long moment before finally sliding it into the hidden keyhole. The metal fit perfectly. Not loosely, not tightly, perfectly, as though it had been waiting there for years. The cellar fell silent. Even the old pipes seemed to stop groaning. Shadow stood beside him, ears forward, eyes fixed on the wall. The German Shepherd's body was tense with anticipation. Jack slowly turned the key. A dull metallic click echoed through the stone room. Then another. Deep inside the wall, hidden mechanisms shifted for the first time in decades. Dust drifted from the mortar. The sound was soft, but it carried the weight of history. Jack stepped back instinctively. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a narrow section of the wall moved inward less than an inch. Shadow immediately stepped forward. His nose touched the opening. The dog inhaled once and looked back at Jack. "Well," Jack said quietly, "I guess we are doing this." He gripped the edge of the concealed panel and pulled. The hidden door resisted at first. Years of dust and disuse had sealed it in place. Then it slowly swung open. Cool air emerged from the darkness beyond. Not stale, not unpleasant, simply old. The scent carried traces of wood, paper, and time. Jack grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf and shined the beam inside. The light revealed a narrow room hidden behind the cellar wall. Small, windowless, forgotten. Wooden shelves lined both sides. A desk sat against the far wall. Dust covered everything. Yet unlike the rest of the cellar, this room felt preserved rather than abandoned. Shadow entered first. The German shepherd moved carefully, examining every corner. His paws stirred thin layers of dust across the floorboards. Jack followed. The beam of his flashlight drifted across shelves filled with boxes, ledgers, and framed photographs. None appeared valuable in the traditional sense. No gold, no stacks of cash, no hidden fortune. Yet the room immediately felt important. Personal. Intentional. Walter had protected this place for a reason. On the desk rested a single object. A wooden box no larger than a briefcase. Unlike everything else in the room, it carried almost no dust. Jack frowned. Someone had touched it more recently. He approached slowly. A brass plate on the lid reflected the flashlight beam. 2 words had been engraved into the metal. For later. Jack felt a chill travel through him. Shadow sat beside the desk and looked directly at the box. Waiting. The same way he had waited beside the wall. The same way he had waited in the cellar for 3 days. Jack carefully opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of letters bundled together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay photographs, journals, and newspaper clippings spanning nearly 50 years. The top letter carried a familiar name written across the envelope, Walter Hayes. Jack slowly removed it. The paper looked fragile but intact. He unfolded the letter and began reading. The first line immediately stopped him cold. If you are reading this, then Shadow found the room. Jack lowered the page and stared at the words. His heartbeat quickened. The dog looked back at him calmly, almost knowingly. He read the sentence again to make sure he had not imagined it. Walter had written the letter years before, long before Jack arrived in town, long before they met. Yet somehow, the old man had expected a German shepherd to lead someone here. Jack looked around the hidden room. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Why had Walter hidden this place? Why mention a dog? And what exactly was inside all these letters? Shadow settled onto the floor beside the desk and released a quiet sigh. For the first time since discovering the secret door, he seemed completely at peace. As though the real search had never been for the room itself. It had been for what waited inside. Jack read the first paragraph 3 times before continuing. The cellar seemed colder now. Not because the temperature had changed, but because the words on the page carried a weight he could not explain. Shadow remained beside the desk, calm and watchful. The German shepherd's amber eyes followed every movement. Dust floated through the beam of the flashlight. The hidden room felt suspended outside of time. Walter's handwriting filled the page with steady blue ink. If you found this room, then the tavern has chosen its next keeper. Jack frowned immediately. The sentence sounded less like a legal instruction and more like a confession. He continued reading. Walter explained that the room had existed for nearly 70 years. Very few people knew about it. Fewer still understood its purpose. The tavern had never been built simply to serve food and drinks. It had become something else during difficult years. A place where people could disappear for a while. A place where pride could rest. A place where struggling families found help without needing to ask for it publicly. Jack lowered the letter and looked around the room. Suddenly the shelves made more sense. The boxes, the journals, the records. This was not a secret vault. It was an archive, a history nobody had preserved except Walter. He opened one of the nearby boxes. Inside rested dozens of envelopes. Each carried a name, local names, family names, some familiar from photographs hanging upstairs, others completely unknown. Curiosity pushed him forward. He selected one at random and opened it carefully. The letter inside came from a rancher written more than 40 years earlier. The man described losing nearly everything during a brutal winter. Feed shortages, debt, fear. Then came a simple sentence. Walter never let my children know we were hungry. Jack stared at the page. Another box contained similar letters. Different years, different families, the same gratitude. Walter had quietly helped people for decades. Not through grand gestures. Through small acts performed when no one was looking. Shadow rose and moved toward a shelf at the far end of the room. His nose touched a framed photograph resting against the wall. Jack followed. The image showed a much younger Walter standing beside several families outside the tavern. Children smiled at the camera. Snow covered the ground. A German shepherd sat beside Walter's leg. Scout. On the back of the frame, a note had been written in fading ink. Home is not where people live. It is where people are welcomed. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. The hidden room was changing shape in his mind. He expected buried money, hidden property deeds, some dramatic secret. Instead, he was discovering a lifetime of kindness. Yet one question remained. Why hide it? He returned to the desk and continued reading Walter's letter. The answer arrived several pages later. People accept help more easily when they do not feel watched. The word stopped him. Walter never wanted recognition, never wanted statues or praise. The room existed because the stories belonged to the people who lived them, not to him. Jack slowly folded the letter. Silence settled around him once more. Then Shadow did something unexpected. The German shepherd stepped toward a lower drawer built into the desk and placed one paw against it. Once, deliberately. Jack looked down. The drawer appeared ordinary, yet so had the wall. He carefully pulled it open. Inside rested a single dusty box smaller than the others. A faded label covered the lid. For the family I never found. The words hit harder than anything he had read so far. Walter had spent decades helping other families. Yet somehow, there had been one he never stopped searching for. And whatever story remained hidden inside that box was important enough to keep separate from everything else. Jack carried the small box upstairs and placed it on the tavern counter beneath the warm glow of an old hanging lamp. Snow continued falling outside, covering Main Street in fresh white silence. The tavern remained empty. Closing time had passed hours earlier. Yet sleep felt impossible now. Shadow settled beside the wood stove, though his eyes never left the box. The German shepherd seemed calmer than before, as if the most important part of the search had finally begun. Jack carefully brushed away the dust covering the lid. The cardboard felt fragile. Time had weakened its edges. Inside rested dozens of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes bundled together with fading ribbon. Unlike the records in the hidden room, these items all focused on a single subject. One family, one search, one unanswered question. Jack opened the first folder. A photograph slipped onto the counter. The image showed a young woman standing beside Walter nearly 50 years earlier. She looked no older than 25. Dark hair, bright smile. One arm wrapped around a small boy standing beside her. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. Mother and son. Written on the back was a single sentence. Emily and Noah. Summer of 1976. Jack frowned. He had never heard Walter mention either name. The next folder contained newspaper clippings, missing persons notices, public records requests, old letters returned unopened. Every page told the same story. Walter had spent decades searching for someone, not because of money, not because of inheritance, because they were family. Jack continued reading. The truth emerged slowly. Years earlier, a misunderstanding and painful family conflict had separated Walter from his daughter Emily. Harsh words were exchanged. Pride took over. Time passed. Then life moved faster than anyone expected. Emily left town with her young son. Contact disappeared. Addresses changed. Phone numbers vanished. By the time Walter tried repairing the relationship, they were gone. Completely. The old tavern owner never stopped searching. Not for a month. Not for a year. For nearly half a century. Jack leaned back against the counter. The room suddenly felt heavier. Every act of kindness. Every family Walter helped. Every person he welcomed through the tavern doors. Perhaps part of him had always been searching for his own family at the same time. Shadow rose and approached the counter. The German shepherd placed his nose gently against another stack of papers. Jack followed the gesture. At the bottom rested a sealed envelope. The paper looked newer than everything else. The date written in the corner stopped him immediately. 3 months before Walter died. Jack opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from a private investigator. His pulse quickened as he read. After years of dead ends, a lead had finally appeared. A woman matching Emily's description had been located decades earlier in Oregon. More importantly, records suggested her son Noah was still alive. The investigator included an address. Not current, but recent. Much more recent than anything else in the box. Jack stared at the page. For several seconds he could not move. Walter had come closer than ever to finding his family, yet there was no indication he ever reached them. No reply. No follow-up. Nothing. Snow tapped softly against the windows. The tavern settled around him with familiar creaks. Shadow sat beside the counter and watched. The German shepherd's expression seemed almost expectant, as though the discovery was not the ending. It was the beginning. Jack looked down at the final page inside the envelope. A handwritten note from Walter appeared beneath the investigator's report. The words were simple. "If you are reading this, then I ran out of time." The retired Navy SEAL swallowed hard. Then he read the final sentence. "Please find them." For the first time since inheriting the tavern, Jack understood what the real legacy was. It was never the building. It was never the hidden room. It was a promise waiting for someone willing to finish it. The next morning, Jack Sullivan loaded a duffel bag, several folders from Walter's hidden archive, and enough supplies for a long drive. Snow still covered portions of the highway as dawn painted the mountains pale gold. The tavern remained quiet behind him. For the first time since inheriting the building, he locked the front door not as a visitor, but as its keeper. Shadow jumped into the truck and settled into the passenger seat. The German shepherd watched him closely while Jack unfolded the investigator's report one more time. The address in Oregon was nearly 6 years old. Not ideal, but not impossible. It was the strongest lead Walter had found in decades. Jack started the engine. "Looks like we are taking a trip, partner." Shadow's ears lifted immediately. The drive lasted most of the day. Small towns passed beyond the windows. Snowfields gave way to forests. Forests gave way to rolling farmland. During long stretches of highway, Jack found himself thinking about Walter. The old tavern owner could have left money to charity. He could have sold the building. Instead, he placed his final hope in a man he barely knew. The responsibility felt heavier than the tavern keys in his pocket. By evening, they reached the Oregon town listed in the report. The place sat between low hills and a winding river. Main Street held a bakery, a feed store, a hardware shop, and little else. The address led them to a modest white house with a weathered porch. Jack parked across the street. His pulse quickened unexpectedly. Years of military operations had taught him to stay calm under pressure. Yet this felt different. More personal. More fragile. Shadow sat upright. Watching. Waiting. A middle-aged woman answered the door after Jack knocked. Her expression shifted from cautious to curious. He introduced himself and explained why he had come. The woman's eyes widened slightly when he mentioned Walter Hayes. "You are about 10 years too late," she said softly. Jack felt disappointment settle into his chest. The woman invited him inside. Family photographs lined the walls. A grandfather clock ticked quietly near the staircase. "Emily lived here for several years," the woman explained. "My husband and I bought the house after she moved." Jack listened carefully. "Do you know where she went?" The woman shook her head. "Not exactly." Hope faded again. Then she added, "But her son might." Jack looked up immediately. "Noah." The woman nodded. That was his name. She disappeared briefly into another room and returned holding an old address book. After several minutes of searching, she pointed toward a phone number written beside a newer address. "Last I heard, he was living near Spokane." Jack thanked her and stepped back outside. The winter air felt sharper now, not because of failure, because the trail was still alive. Later that night, inside a roadside motel, Jack called the number. The line rang 4 times. Then a man answered. The voice sounded cautious, older than expected. Jack introduced himself. Silence followed. Long silence. When he finally mentioned Walter Hayes, the man stopped breathing for a moment. At least that was how it sounded. "Why are you asking about him?" Noah's voice carried something difficult to identify. Pain, curiosity, hope, perhaps all three. Jack looked toward Shadow resting near the window. Snow drifted beneath the glow of the parking lot lights outside. "Because Walter spent most of his life trying to find you." Another silence followed, even longer this time. Then Noah asked a question so quietly Jack almost missed it. "Is he still alive?" The retired Navy SEAL closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, he realized the hardest part of Walter's unfinished story had only just begun. Jack did not answer immediately. The motel room felt smaller now. Snow drifted beyond the window while Shadow remained curled beside the heater, watching quietly. On the other end of the line, Noah Hayes waited. The silence between them carried decades of distance neither man fully understood. Finally, Jack spoke. "No. The single word landed heavily. Noah exhaled slowly. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just the sound of someone receiving news he had expected and feared at the same time. For several seconds neither man said anything. Then Noah asked the question that mattered most. Did he suffer? Jack looked toward the stack of letters resting on the small motel desk. Walter's handwriting covered nearly every page. No, he answered softly. He was not alone. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Sadder, yet somehow lighter. As though uncertainty had finally given way to truth. Noah cleared his throat. Why did he spend so many years looking for me? Jack closed his eyes briefly. The answer surrounded him in photographs, journals, and faded envelopes. Because he never stopped loving his family. The line remained quiet. Then Noah laughed once. A small broken laugh. Funny thing. Jack listened. My mother used to say the same thing. The words stayed with him long after the call ended. The next morning, Jack and Shadow continued north toward Spokane. The drive carried them through mountain passes and frozen valleys beneath a pale winter sky. The farther they traveled, the more Jack thought about Walter. About regret. About second chances. About how many people spend their lives waiting too long to say what matters. By early afternoon, they arrived at a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Small houses lined quiet streets. Bare trees stood beneath low clouds. Nothing about the place seemed remarkable. Yet somewhere here lived the final chapter of Walter's story. Noah Hayes answered the door himself. He looked to be in his early 50s. Broad shoulders, weathered face, kind eyes that carried years of unanswered questions. The resemblance to Walter appeared immediately. Not exact, but undeniable. Jack recognized it within seconds. So did Shadow. The German shepherd approached slowly. Noah stared at the dog, then at Jack. You actually came. Jack nodded. I said I would. Inside the house, family photographs covered the walls. Children, graduations, birthdays, ordinary moments. The life Walter never got to see. Noah brewed coffee while Jack unpacked the documents from the tavern. Letters, photographs, records, piece by piece. Walter's hidden archives spread across the kitchen table. Noah examined each item carefully. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes tears filled his eyes. Most often he simply stared. A faded photograph of his mother stopped him completely. I have not seen this picture in 40 years. His voice trembled slightly. Jack watched quietly. This was never his story. He was only carrying it. The true owners were finally sitting across from it. Hours passed. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, generations slowly reconnected through paper and memory. Then Noah discovered one final envelope hidden among Walter's documents. Unlike the others, it had never been opened. His own name appeared on the front, written by Walter decades earlier. Noah's hands shook as he unfolded the letter. The room became silent. Even Shadow seemed to understand the importance of the moment. Noah read the first page, then the second. Tears slipped down his face before he reached the end. Finally, he lowered the letter and looked toward Jack. He never blamed us. The words barely escaped above a whisper. Jack nodded. He already knew. Walter's hidden room had never been built to preserve bitterness. It existed to preserve hope. And sitting at that kitchen table, surrounded by snow and old photographs, Noah finally understood that his grandfather had been waiting for him all along. Jack remained in Spokane for 2 more days. The snow finally stopped, leaving the city wrapped beneath a blanket of white that reflected the pale winter sunlight. During those 48 hours, something remarkable happened. Decades of silence began to unravel, not through dramatic revelations, not through shocking discoveries, through conversations, long overdue conversations. Noah Hayes shared stories his mother told him as a child. Stories about a small Montana town, a warm tavern filled with laughter, a stubborn father who made mistakes but loved deeply. Walter's letters filled the missing spaces between those memories. Together they created a bridge across nearly 50 years. One afternoon, Noah opened a faded family album he had not touched in years. The pages crackled softly as he turned them. Photographs showed birthdays, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, and ordinary moments that suddenly felt extraordinary. Jack watched from across the room while Shadow rested near the fireplace. The German shepherd seemed completely at home. Noah eventually stopped on a particular photograph and smiled through tears. The image showed a young boy sitting beside a German shepherd. That was Scout, he said quietly. Jack looked closer. The resemblance to Shadow was impossible to ignore. Same intelligent eyes. Same posture. Same calm confidence. Noah laughed softly. Grandpa used to say Scout could find things nobody else knew were lost. The room fell silent. Both men looked toward Shadow. The German shepherd lifted his head as if he had heard his name. Then he returned to resting beside the fire. Later that evening, Noah made a decision. He folded Walter's final letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he looked toward Jack. I want to see it. Jack already knew what he meant. The tavern. Noah nodded. The answer came without hesitation. The tavern. 3 days later, they drove back to Montana together. Snow-covered mountains passed beyond the windows. Miles disappeared beneath the tires. The farther they traveled, the quieter Noah became. Not because he was afraid. Because some journeys become heavier as they approach their destination. Shadow rode comfortably in the back seat. Occasionally, he lifted his head and looked toward the road ahead, almost as though he knew exactly where they were going. By late afternoon, the town finally appeared beneath a golden winter sunset. Main Street looked much the same as before. Small shops, familiar storefronts, smoke drifting from chimneys. Yet for Noah, everything felt new. He stared through the windshield without speaking. When the tavern finally came into view, his breath caught. The building stood exactly where Walter left it. The faded sign swayed gently in the cold wind. Light glowed from the windows. Warm, welcoming, alive. Jack parked near the front entrance. Neither man moved immediately. Noah simply sat there looking at the building. Then he smiled. I know this place. The words emerged almost as a whisper. Jack looked over. Noah laughed softly. I have not been here since I was 6 years old. Yet somehow, memory remained. The smell of wood smoke. The shape of the porch. The sound of the sign moving in the wind. Some places leave footprints on the heart. They waited patiently for recognition. Shadow jumped from the truck first and walked toward the front door. Noah followed. Slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a sacred place. When he stepped inside, the tavern seemed to welcome him back. The wood stove glowed softly. The photographs remained on the walls. The tables sat exactly where generations had gathered before him. Noah stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. Tears filled his eyes. Not from grief, from belonging. And for the first time since Walter's hidden room had been discovered, Jack understood the true purpose of the tavern. It was never meant to preserve secrets. It was built to bring people home. Spring arrived early that year. Snow melted from the mountains. Rivers swelled with fresh runoff. Wildflowers began appearing along the roads leading into town. The tavern stood exactly where it always had, but something about it felt different now. The old building no longer carried the weight of unfinished stories. The hidden room had been opened. The letters had been delivered. The family Walter Hayes spent half a lifetime searching for had finally returned. One Saturday evening, nearly 6 months after Jack Sullivan first walked through the front door, the tavern filled with people. Every table was occupied. Laughter drifted through the room. Glasses clinked softly. Children moved between booths while older residents shared stories near the fireplace. The atmosphere felt warm, familiar, alive. Above the bar hung a new photograph. Walter stood smiling beside Scout outside the tavern many years earlier. Beneath the frame rested a small brass plaque. No grand title, no dramatic tribute, just a simple sentence. He always left the light on. Jack noticed visitors stopping to read it throughout the evening. Most smiled. A few wiped away tears. Noah Hayes stood near the fireplace, talking with townspeople who remembered him as a child. Every day, he seemed to belong a little more. Every week, another missing piece found its place. He no longer felt like a visitor. He felt like family. Because he was. Shadow rested beside the wood stove, exactly where Scout once sat according to the old photographs. The German shepherd had become part of the tavern's identity. Travelers asked about him. Children brought him treats. Regular customers saved a chair near the fire as though he were another patron. Shadow accepted all of it with quiet dignity. He never sought attention. Yet somehow, he always became part of the story. Later that evening, after the last customers left and the final dishes were cleaned, silence settled over the tavern once more. Not lonely silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that follows a good day. Jack stood behind the bar while Noah balanced the day's receipts. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, the wood stove glowed softly. You know what I keep thinking about? Noah asked. Jack looked up. What? Noah smiled and glanced toward Shadow. If he never stared at that wall, none of this happens. The retired Navy SEAL followed his gaze. The German shepherd rested peacefully near the fire. Eyes closed, completely content. Jack laughed quietly. I have learned not to question him. Noah nodded. Smart man. They sat in silence for several moments. Then Noah looked around the room. The photographs, the tables, the worn wooden floors, the place his grandfather spent decades protecting. He never wanted people to remember him, Noah said softly. Jack thought about the hidden room, the letters, the families Walter helped, the secrets he carried without asking for recognition. No, Jack agreed. He wanted people to remember each other. The answer lingered in the warm air. Somehow it explained everything. The tavern, the hidden archive, the search for family, the acts of kindness nobody knew about. Walter understood something most people spend their lives trying to learn. Places matter because of the people inside them. The rain continued falling outside. Shadow lifted his head briefly and looked toward the fireplace. Then he settled back onto his blanket. The room felt complete, not because every question had been answered, but because every heart had found its way home. Jack walked to the front door and switched off the final light above the entrance. Through the window, the tavern glowed softly against the darkness of Main Street. Warm, welcoming, alive, the same way it had welcomed strangers for generations. And as the rain drifted across the quiet Montana night, the old building stood exactly as Walter intended. Not as a tavern, not as an inheritance, but as a place where lost people could find their way back to one another. Some buildings survive because they are built with wood and stone. Others survive because they are built with love,